Hello and welcome to Checking the Vitals, a podcast powered by SpecialtyCare. I'm Todd Schlosser, and joining me today is Kristina Young, the Director of Clinical Development at SpecialtyCare. In this episode, we discuss how her path to medical school actually led her to a career in intraoperative neuromonitoring, how she developed a passion for guiding new IONM clinicians, and how she does that in her role at SpecialtyCare. We also examine what a new hire in SpecialtyCare's IONM program can expect out of that experience. Enjoy the conversation. So, Kristina, thank you so much for joining us here on Checking the Vitals. I appreciate you taking the time today. I'd like to start out just by asking you, what was it that made you want to work in healthcare in general?
So when I first went to college, I was a little bit undecided about what it was that I wanted to do when I grew up.
Okay.
My parents had always pushed me to be a pharmacist because they were, both my mother and father worked at a supermarket. And they got to see, a pharmacist every single day, and they kept thinking, this is such a cool job, this is what you should do.
Yeah.
And since I was undecided, I decided, you know what, I'll go that route. Let me go to pharmacy school, I'll be a pharmacist.
Sure.
So I went to college for about 2 years at Florida State, and then when I came home one summer, I interned at a pharmacy. I was actually at the supermarket that my parents worked at, which was at Publix. And I spent the entire summer working as a pharmacy technician and left that summer realizing that I did not want to be that person.
Okay.
I wanted to be someone who was more hands-on with patients. And not just I really kind of felt like I was just counting pills.
Yeah.
But I also saw what the pharmacist did, and I felt that was the same. It just wasn't enough, and I knew it wasn't enough for me.
Yeah, because I think the patient interaction between a pharmacist and a patient is really just have you taken these drugs before? And you're sort of talking them through that, but there really isn't much outside of that, right?
Right.
Okay.
I felt I wanted more. So when I went back to Florida State, I looked into what gears would I have to change because now I wanted to go to medical school.
Right.
So that's what I decided. I changed my major to biology, and I had a track to go to medical school. And that was how I got into the healthcare field. So
was the medical school track in service of being a doctor one day, or was it another path that you had already thought out at that point?
Yeah, so I actually really wanted to be an infertility specialist.
Oh, wow, okay.
So I had known some people who were struggling with infertility at the time. And then when I was doing my pre-med track, I took a huge interest in genetics.
Yeah.
And it kind of just curved my mind, and that's what I decided that I wanted to do when I graduated from college to go to medical school for.
Yeah. So when did that change into what is now your career in interoperative neuromonitoring?
So when I was pretty much in, I think, my second to last semester, and I came home for winter break, and I went out with a group of friends. And when I was out that night, I ran into an old acquaintance. So ironically, somebody I went to middle school, high school, and college with. But we were just nothing more than acquaintances.
Sure.
And so I started talking to him, and he had started doing this really awesome new job. He was just getting out of training, and he was just finishing up his clinical training as a surgical neurophysiologist. This was 14 years ago.
Okay.
So it was with a different company. And I was just so intrigued by everything that he was telling me. And it was funny because I was asking him about his career over some loud music and a cocktail. And I was like, really? That sounds so cool. So, the next day, I woke up in the morning and said to myself, I want to find out more about the job that I just learned about last night. So I'll date myself a little bit here. I already told you it was 14 years ago, but I had to find this person on MySpace and send them a message to ask, is there any way that you could call me and we could talk more about this career that you mentioned last night?
Yeah. Awesome. So you start digging into it then, and then sort of, at least in your mind, change your career track over to interoperative neuromonitoring. So did you finish, I'm assuming you finished your bachelor's in biology, correct?
Yes.
And then at that point, did you enter into an IONM program?
Yeah, so at that time, once I learned more about intraoperative neuromonitoring, I had decided that for myself, I still wanted to go to medical school.
Oh, okay.
But that I was going to spend 2 years at least working in intraoperative neuromonitoring. That way I could get exposure to the operating room.
Sure.
That would look good for my medical school applications as well, having worked in the OR for 2 years. So I went that route. I started working with an intraoperative neuromonitoring company. I went through a formal training program, and after 2 years in the field, I had changed my plans. I decided that intraoperative monitoring was very fulfilling for me, and I no longer wanted to go back to medical school. I was happy in my career.
Well, that's awesome. So you sort of stayed on that career path and eventually matriculated over to specialty care. So how did you end up in your current role here at Specialty Care?
So I was working at a company called Sentient. I started working there in 2010. So my first company I worked at for 2 years, and then I applied for and started working at Sentient. I came on as a surgical neurophysiologist, and within about 6 or 8 months, I started assisting the clinical manager. So really kind of working as an assistant clinical manager, but without a formal title.
Sure.
He taught me how to make the schedule, how to put out fires in the field, how
sort of
to
like manage people
yes,
outside
exactly.
of managing
cases. He taught
cases.
me how to manage people.
Yeah.
And so after I did that for about, well, I should also add that that manager then had a baby and took some time off. And during that time, I was the stand-in clinical manager.
Okay.
And I worked and lived in South Florida. And at that time, there were, I think, only 2 or 3 clinical managers in all of South Florida.
Okay.
And we were growing.
Yeah.
So once a new position opened up for a clinical manager, I applied for that. I knew that was, I've been doing it for about a year and a half. I really enjoyed the position. So I applied had multiple rounds of interviews, and eventually moved into the position of a clinical manager. At that point, I think I had been in the field for about 4 or 5 years.
Okay. And that was still with Sentient?
That was with Sentient.
Okay.
Yeah, so I started out as a clinical manager for West Palm Beach, Florida.
Okay.
Then I moved to a different territory, and I was managing Miami, Florida.
Okay.
And then eventually I moved into the education and training department.
Right.
Again, this was at Sentient, and I worked along with and under Brian Willett.
Okay.
Brian Willett.
Well, who also is now at Specialty Care
Yes,
as well. Yeah.
yes.
So I'd imagine that you sort of came over at the same time that Brian did.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. So when I was at Sentient and I was working alongside with Brian, we'd started bringing in training classes at Sentient, just
Yes.
like we're doing here at Specialty Care.
Yeah.
The formal training program was a little bit more in its infancy as compared to where we are at here. And we did not have a formalized CNIM board prep program at Sentient.
Okay.
So one of the first roles that I took on when I moved into the education program, I said, we need to have a prep program.
Yeah.
I mean, it's super important. Our students are struggling to pass the exam. We need to really formalize the entire process. So, Brian really focused on our SN1, it would have been like SN1 training program
Sure.
at Sentient, and I was really hyper-focused on the board prep program.
Right.
So about a year into that, I had finished creating a board prep program and working with a lot of our students who had gone through our training program. And it was just about the time that was finished that Specialty Care then acquired Sentient.
Yeah.
And that was in 2016.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so you've come on to Specialty Care, and it seems like your role now is sort of similar to the role you had at Sentient, because you still focus on helping the SN1s pass their boards, specifically in what is now, and I'm sure it wasn't at that point, but is now sort of phase 2 and phase 3 of the what we call IONM New Hire program, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So Julie Trott, who we need to get on this program as well, who covers the first sort of phase, if you will. That's a lot of didactic, a lot of classroom, although now online through Zoom. What is phase 2 and 3 like, sort of where you take the helm with these new students?
Yeah,
What's that like?
It's a good question, because first and foremost, Julie and I, we kind of split the entire training program.
Yeah.
We have our hands in bits and pieces. Julie is the mastermind behind all the didactic curriculum delivery, everything in phase 1. I do always join the students during phase 1 as well. I'm part of the interview process.
Sure.
I always come to meet them. If the students come to Nashville, I come to Nashville as well as I also log on into Zoom meetings and just get to know them.
Yeah.
Now, when all the students are in phase 1, they are learning all of the didactic curriculum delivery, working in groups, working on projects. They're just immersed in all the education.
Yeah.
Now, another component of phase 1 that sometimes confuses people a little is they are also going into the operating room,
Yes.
paired with clinical instructors and learning hands-on how to do the job, right?
Yeah.
The entire field. Now, when our students move to phase 2, it's because they've been deemed clinically competent to perform 2 types of procedures in the OR without having a clinical instructor physically present with them.
Okay. So they have still the remote neuromonitoring team sort of helping them as a safety net, but there's not that person in the OR with them sort of standing over their shoulder, making sure everything's right.
Correct.
Okay.
At least that would go for the 2 types of procedures
Sure.
they've been deemed independent for.
Sure.
So there are many types of procedures that we monitor in intraoperative neuromonitoring.
Yeah.
So anytime there's a new procedure that they have not been deemed competent on, they will have a clinical instructor with them again.
Right.
But as they move to phase 2, one of the things that I do with all of the students is I log on for their first anywhere from 5 to 10 cases, and I monitor remotely with them. So not just the remote physician,
Sure.
I'm also logging on. I'm helping them with troubleshooting. I'm looking over their documentation. I'm giving them feedback on things they're doing great on, things that they could improve. And once they've submitted their case, I'm auditing their CDS files as well. So this is really just an oversight to see, now that you're on your own, are you basically crossing all your T's, dotting all of your I's, moving forward into phase 2?
I'd imagine that as a new SN1 who's now moving into phase 2, having you there would be a great relief to me, because I'd be very nervous. Like, what if something goes wrong? Who do I reach out to? And I could just, is it a messaging type program that you guys use, like Jabber?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So they would message me on Jabber, but then I log on to their case in a secure connection, just like the remote physician, and I can chat with them through that secure channel and also view their screens as well.
Okay.
But once that ends and they're no longer logging on with me, they are always going to have support in case of, just needing an extra eye to look on things or some troubleshooting help. And we have a support line, IONM clinical support, that one of our other directors is always on, so that he can log on to their cases, and that person is Tom Eplin.
Yeah.
He can log on to their cases as well and provide support.
Okay. Now, does that go even post passing your CNMs or your boards, I should say?
Yes, that's eligible for every employee in the company.
Okay.
But we really stress it to our SN1s because we want them to know that the resource is there. Being the most green in the field, they would probably reach out the most to support.
Yeah, and I'd imagine, not to reiterate it again, but that would be a huge relief to me going in for the first time by myself, being like, okay, well, if in the odd chance something does go wrong, I'll be fine.
Right.
We'll figure it out.
Exactly.
It's a huge relief. So moving from doing the cases yourself to managing the people doing the cases to training the people to do the cases, what are those differences at each phase of that career progression for you?
So to be honest, each of those areas are completely different from one another. So in the beginning, when I was working as a surgical neurophysiologist, and this was not for specialty care, but I did a lot of driving. So where I was living initially, which was in Tampa, Florida, I didn't have hospitals that were close to my house. So I was driving an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours in the morning to my cases. And I was working very long hours, also studying for my boards exam. And it was challenging, to say the least. When I moved into management, I learned that I was now responsible for many people. So not just the surgical neurophysiologists that I manage, but also the happiness of the surgeons and the staff and the hospital administrators. And my stress load definitely increased, right? Because there were times, especially when we were really busy around the holidays. Every year we would get really busy around the holidays. And sometimes surgical neurophysiologists would start to feel a little burnt out because their hours were higher than normal. And then it was the same for me because I'm trying to keep the peace with everybody that I work with as well. And I'm also doing cases too. So there were times when it was challenging, but overall I really enjoyed getting to manage and work with surgical neurophysiologists. And I always did help to train them, to help enhance their education, because I always had an interest in education. Which is kind of why and how I got into education. So I was living in South Florida at the time. And we didn't have a formalized board prep, which I mentioned to you. And a lot of the surgical neurophysiologists at that time, again, this was early sentient years, were having a hard time passing their boards exam. So what I would do on the weekends is I would take a bunch of surgical neurophysiologists. We went to a public library that had a whiteboard, and I was teaching CNM prep to my coworkers.
Just at a public library?
Yes, at a public library. They had like an open room with a whiteboard. And so I was doing that every Saturday from like 9 to 11:30 because I wanted my coworkers to pass the boards exam. And I felt bad because I came from a formalized training program and I didn't struggle to take and pass my boards, and yet my coworkers were. And I think that was part of what the management or upper management at Sentient saw in me, that okay, this person is able to teach board prep. And those students that I was teaching actually did all pass the exam. So
that's awesome.
And it was really gratifying for me.
Not only able to teach board prep, but like took the initiative to teach when that wasn't really quite your role at that point, right?
No, it wasn't.
You were
my
more
role.
like a clinical manager at that point, I'd imagine.
Actually, at that time, I wasn't even a clinical manager. That's when I was working as the assistant to the clinical manager.
Okay. So I would immediately, if I was in upper management, be like, this person should be in education somewhere because they're doing it anyway.
I realized that I had a strong passion for it. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed teaching the students, And then I really enjoyed the text message or call where they said, I passed, finally. This is the third time I've taken the exam, and today I passed, and it's thanks to you. And it was just really gratifying.
Yeah. I'd imagine that you still get a lot of those calls, because when here in your capacity at Specialty Care, you are the one that leads them from after Julie hands them off from the didactic sort of classroom training. You're the last person until they pass the CNIPs, correct?
Right.
So what are those last, is it 6 months? Is it 8 months? How long are they in phase 2 and 3 before they can take their boards?
Good question. So everybody moves to phase 2 at their own pace. So some students will move a little bit faster than others. And this has to do with their markets and just how long it takes them to achieve clinical competency.
Right.
In phase 2, we have additional didactic materials that Julie does some webinars with them. I log on with the students and I do case defenses with them. So the educational component does not go away, but the students are more focused on monitoring cases, because in order to be eligible to take the boards exam, they have to have been an active participant in 150 cases. So they're working towards getting those 150 cases. All of the students in an SM1 cohort will start phase 3 at the same time. And usually this is about like 9 to 10 months into the training program. So that date is set in stone when they're hired. Sometimes it can be pushed a couple weeks, pushed this way or that way, because it really depends on cases that they've monitored as well. So when we start the entire cohort in phase 3, that is the beginning of a 10-week program to prepare for the boards.
So that's the ramp-up period.
That's the ramp-up period.
We're going.
So they're continuing to do cases while they're in phase 3. But now they have modules to do. We have an app on the cell phone that delivers them practice questions to work towards the CNIM. And then we also have live webinars. So I host a few live webinars during the entire series. And then at the very end, like right before they would apply and take the exam, I meet with the students on either a one-on-one or a two-on-one basis. And I do what we call a readiness assessment. Julie helps with these as well. So if there's a lot of students in the class, Julie will also do some of these readiness assessments. And we go through a PowerPoint where we're kind of just having conversation with them, quizzing them, and then at the end deeming you're ready to test, or we want to give you another 2 or 3 weeks to continue to study, because our goal is that we want all of our students to be successful on the first attempt.
And from what I understand, and clearly correct me if I'm wrong, but that's very, very common that people who have gone through the Specialty Care IONM training pass the first time when they take their boards.
Because in phase 1, Julie lays the groundwork, and then repetition is key. So in phase 2, there's additional education, and a lot of it is going over the concepts you were taught in phase 1, but now you've been in the operating room. So you got to see those concepts applied, and now as you relearn them, they start to make more sense. Then you get to phase 3, and here we have repetition again, but we also build on things that are more specific to the exam, that maybe weren't so specific to our normal practices or any, kind of like the groundwork that was laid. There's more, guidelines. The students have to learn and memorize and understand specific guidelines that are more specific to the exam than maybe we use in everyday practice. Then in addition, I mentioned to you that app, Axonify. That will deliver practice questions to students that Julie and I have written. And we've written the same questions in multiple different ways. So if our students answer a question and get it wrong or don't have high confidence, they're given that question again in like 2 or 3 days. So once they get to the end of the Axonify app, they see that question and they answer it with high confidence and they're right. And that really helps to instill the answers to these complicated questions.
So I'd imagine there's sort of a handoff period after their first 8 weeks when they're done with the classroom training or the didactic training, when you sort of take over the cohort, right? What is that handoff process like? How well do they know you beforehand? You mentioned that you're in on the interview, so you're not a stranger to them at that point. But I'd imagine they get to know you a lot better over the next few months. So what is that handoff process like?
So when the students are in phase 1, like I mentioned, I come up here and I will see them either in Nashville or Zoom. And most of them already remember me because I'm in the interviews for every single one of the SM1s that we hire, as well as before their interview, I'm doing phone screens. So I would say I've talked to about half of them on the phone before they even come in for their interview. So as far as the handoff is concerned, it's not really like a formal handoff as much as, Julie and I both have our hands in the pot at all times. We work very closely together. She just has more of a bulk of phase 1. I have more of a bulk of phase 3, and we kind of share phase 2. So her and I communicate every single day. We're on the phone, we're talking on Jabber, we're very close, and we work very closely together. There's certain times that I'm going to grade papers and projects from, phase 1 for Julie, and there's certain times that she's going to help me out with a CNIM prep webinar. So we really kind of just work together a lot on that.
Yeah, and there's no formal handoff, really.
Not really,
and they'll see Julie throughout the process. They'll see you throughout the process.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. So Sentient was acquired by SpecialtyCare in 2016-ish. And I know that a lot of growth that SpecialtyCare has in IONM is through acquisition. So speaking from someone who's gone through the experience of being acquired, what was that experience like for you?
So I remember the day, this is a great question. I remember the day when I found out that we were being acquired. Yeah. And I remember exactly where I was. I mean, that's how scared I was at the time.
I would be too.
I was on vacation with my family, and we were in Tennessee in a cabin.
Oh, wow, okay.
Go figure.
Yeah.
And, I heard the news, and the first thing I did was got on my phone and started looking up reviews for SpecialtyCare. You know, I wanted to read Glassdoor. I wanted to read everything there was to read.
Absolutely.
And my coworkers and I, we were very apprehensive. You know, we'd never heard anything good about an acquisition. So initially, our fears were very high.
Yeah.
But ironically, kind of as time went on, SpecialtyCare did a really great job of just merging together the two companies. So it wasn't like a big old slap in the face, conform to us, conform to SpecialtyCare. It was a process where every couple months there was a new rollout. Mm-hmm. And what I really like that about SpecialtyCare, because I don't think that you should acquire another company and have a bunch of different little companies under the SpecialtyCare umbrella that are doing things their own way. Right? Because it's important that we're unified.
Yeah.
And at the time when I was working at Sentient, there had been kind of a unique pay structure. Our employees were being paid for 35 hours if they worked under 35 hours instead of being paid for 40, like a typical salary.
Okay.
And a lot of the employees were not happy by that. They were very disgruntled.
Yeah.
And that changed. We actually saw a lot of positive changes when we came to SpecialtyCare.
Good.
Better benefits, better company culture.
Yeah.
More resources. So, we had people at SpecialtyCare that were responsible for credentialing and education. And there was just a lot more resources that if you were a surgical neurophysiologist, you had someone where to turn to.
Sure.
And there wasn't really turnover. I mean, the people that I know, at least, that came from Sentient stayed with SpecialtyCare. And the acquisition went really well, and it was a very positive experience.
That's good to hear. I do know that a lot of people are apprehensive of acquisitions and things like that. And I totally understand that, having gone through a few of those myself at another company, but I realized that we were acquired by a bigger company, and that meant things like better benefits because they were able to negotiate for better benefits, more support staff to help you with things that you need to do for your job. So I'm not surprised that was your experience, but it's, I think, good to reiterate because everyone, in my mind, thinks of acquisitions as like the villains in 80s movies, and it's not always that way. I'm sure there have been bad experiences, but it's not always that way.
Absolutely.
So, excellent.
And I'll add something. I think one of the biggest perks for me when I came on to SpecialtyCare was learning about, like I said, the benefits, but specific benefits like tuition reimbursement.
Yeah.
I did not have that at any of my former companies in intraoperative neuromonitoring, so I was able to go back and take online classes towards my master's degree.
Awesome.
And it was paid for by SpecialtyCare.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on the number, but it's somewhere around $5,000 a year. So you can physically get your entire master's degree without paying a dime, as long as you don't want to overload yourself with courses because you're also working.
Yeah.
So you can take your time getting it, but it's just really nice that you're afforded that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
In addition, you get continuing education monies so that you can go to things like ASNM meetings and ASET meetings. It's $1,500 a year. That rolls over, I believe, up to 3 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So if you wanted to make one of the big international trips, go to Europe for one of these conferences, that would pay for your airfare and your hotel and your meals, and you could have a great trip out of that.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah. So, some of these things that I had never had in any of my former employers was just such a plus.
Yeah, excellent. I do want to close with one final question, and I really ask people who are in a position sort of like yours because you answer this question a lot, I'd imagine, and that is, when you're talking to somebody who is interested in looking at IONM as a field, and then SpecialtyCare's program for prepping people who are going into that field, what is your, for lack of a better term, sales pitch to get them to at least look and consider the career and then consider specialty care?
Absolutely. So I would say it really depends when they're coming to me with this question. So I've actually, we have a SN1 within our program right now who reached out to me as a senior in high school.
Oh, wow.
And because her mother was a physical therapist, actually the physical therapist for my daughter. And we were talking one day and I was telling her about the field and she was just, I would love to tell my daughter about this. She doesn't know what she wants to do when she grows up. I mean, she was a senior in high school. And, it was funny because after speaking to her, 4 years later, she contacted me again.
That's wild.
She said, this is the major that I picked in college. I'm really interested about doing with getting into intraoperative neuromonitoring. What are my next steps?
Sure.
And so I had this exact conversation with her.
Yeah.
Her degree was in psychology. She had taken anatomy and physiology and all that, and I could tell by talking to her on the phone, she was incredibly intelligent and motivated individual.
Yeah.
I said to her, here's the things that I would like you to do at the same time while applying to the company.
Sure.
And I recommended some courses for her just to kind of brush up her anatomy, physiology, neuroscience background.
Yeah.
Apply to the company, what you got to work on your resume, et cetera. But there are options for people. They can take a course in neurophysiology. There's other things out there that they can do, but they have to pay for that.
Right.
Versus coming to specialty care and joining our specialty care university where you're paid while you're in training, which is quite nice.
I think that's the best benefit.
That's the best benefit, right? And so many people ask me on the phone, well, do I have a job when I finish the training program? I said, well, you have a job when you started the training program. We are hiring you. This is your job.
And you have benefits.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So you are an employee day one of training. As opposed to paying for a university to give you a certificate or in neuromonitoring.
Right.
But I really just kind of set them on the track. You want to go to college with, the mindset of let me get a degree in science. So biology or some physics or biomedical engineering, neuroscience, something that gives you the foundation so that you have a neuroscience foundation that you can then build upon in our training program. Because we do assume that everybody who comes into our training program knows about an axon, knows, basic cell neurophysiology.
Sure. Excellent. So I guess my last little part of that question was, why do you think specialty care is the right program to go to? Now, you mentioned things when you were answering that last question about, getting paid from day one to be in training to learn all this stuff and the benefits from day one. So is that the main selling point to the IONM training program here at Specialty Care, or are there other selling points?
So that's one of the main selling points, of course.
Sure.
But I don't want to pat myself on the shoulder too much. But we have a very good training program, and the fact that our students, for the most part, all of them are going to be passing their boards exam on the first attempt. We take that very seriously. Yeah. There's other training programs out there. There's smaller hospitals that just do on-the-job training. But the problem is that when those students get ready to take their boards exam, they're not prepared.
Right.
So then they either have to pay out of pocket for a program to attend to learn everything for the boards exam, or they pay all this money to take the exam and then they're not successful.
Yeah.
So at Specialty Care, we give all of our students everything they need to know. And I tell this to the students all the time. If I could just stick a USB in your ear and upload it all, that would be great. But you have to do your part as well.
Absolutely.
We're going to continuously feed you the information, teach you everything you need to know, but you have to really apply yourself. You have to study. You have to make yourself understand it. But all the resources are there for all of our students at Specialty Care.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us here on Checking the Vitals. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Checking the Vitals. If you enjoyed the content we provide, please leave us a 5-star rating and review. It really does help people find the show. And make sure you subscribe so you hear our interviews with healthcare innovators every Monday.